We have another all-star panel for you today. You know me, I'm Bill Glassgold. Down at my end is Catherine Barrett and Rich Green, who are writing partners, consultants of the Volcker Alliance, and have been watching state budgets a heck of a lot longer than I have, and know a lot about processes as well as what's good and what's bad. Next to them is Seth Grove, state representative from Pennsylvania, who is the sponsor of a really interesting bill to get consensus forecasting put in place there. There's another bill in New Jersey, so we're watching what Seth's doing there. Becca Hendrick, who is part of the Volcker team, as well as professor at University of Illinois Chicago. She's going to set the scene for us. And John Hicks, to my right, my friend from Kentucky, is head of NASBO and former deputy state budget director in Kentucky, and a great resource for us all on data and perceptions and trends. Just two little quick notes. Becca's, as I said, is going to kick off to talk about fiscal stress politics and policies for managing stress. And we'll get to that. But why is this panel so important? Why is Becca's presentation so important? We've heard a lot about rainy day funds this morning. NASBO and Pew and Moody's Analytics are telling us that rainy day funds are growing again. They're in pretty good shape. You know, many states are well prepared, but there was a very stark warning that came out about a week ago from Eric Rosengren and Joe Peak of the Boston Fed, saying maybe a lot of states are not in such good shape and don't count on the Fed in the next recession to bail them out. The Fed doesn't do state aid, of course, but what the Fed has is at its command is interest rates. And they pointed out that in previous recessions, interest rates have fallen by, I think it's a median of 6%. And the Fed doesn't have 6% to give this time around unless something really remarkable happens in the next few months. So the Fed is saying for states that do get affected by any recession down the road, the amount of buffer provided by the central bank is going to be very, very limited, and that's why it's important for states to do that stress testing now, look at their options now, build their reserves now, because you're not going to get it from Congress and you're not going to get it from the Fed. So it's really every man and every woman for themselves. And with that, I want to turn it over to Becca, and then we're going to have a discussion on this new reality.
Thanks. Well, the research I'm going to talk about, we're going to be presenting at the Association Talk of Financial Management in a couple of weeks. But I'd first of all like to, my co-author is Xiaoyang Hu, who's up there in the audience, who's been working, she worked with me last year on Volcker, and then Mingyu Khan is working with me this year on the Volcker question. So what I've done here in this research is to take kind of a broader view, I think, of the 5 categories of financial management practices than maybe some of the other folks have that have been working on the Volcker project and publishing and writing papers on this. So basically, I look at how these 5 categories of financial management practices, and if you look in your booklet there that you received, you'll see those 5 different areas of practice, which are forecasting, budget maneuvers, legacy costs, reserve funds, and transparency. And I look at how these 5 categories, the grades that Volcker has assigned for each of the states, how they are associated with different time frames of fiscal solvency, as well as several features of state level political and institutional arrangements. And I'm just going to, today, right now, I'm just going to talk about the fiscal solvency end of it. And what I did is to put this investigation into the context of quite a bit of earlier research and current research that is going on about, looks at how governments, state and local governments manage fiscal stress. And, you know, this goes back to some of the early work of Charles Levine and Alan Schick, who were looking at how state and local governments would respond to fiscal stress in the late 70s and the early 1980s, local governments especially when federal revenue sharing went away. And what these individuals found, their colleagues, also there was a number of books and articles that were published, as well as my own research that looks at Chicago suburban municipalities. They found this hierarchical approach to responding to fiscal shocks and business cycles. And in this hierarchical approach, there are what they refer to as first-line strategies that delay and absorb the fiscal pressures through the use of buffers, such as the rainy day fund, and less dramatic strategies for managing the fiscal shocks and the business cycles. One of those less dramatic strategies, which we've talked about here, which is not very good, is underfunding your capital infrastructure. But that's one of the first-line strategies I think the governments turn to. Once, if the fiscal stress or the fiscal shocks continue or become more worse, they move to the second-line strategies, where they employ more dramatic changes to revenues and spending, such as hiring freezes, across-the-board cuts, increases in fees and charges, and the whole host of budgetary maneuvers that we have in that one category of answers to the Volcker questions. And then in the third-line strategies, they're really having problems, and in this case, there are investing in strategies that are much more risky and involve visible changes to revenues and spending, canceling services, raising visible revenues, issuing pension bonds, these kinds of things. So what I'm looking at the relationships between these 5 categories of fiscal practices and actually 4 areas of budgetary solvency. These are areas of budgetary solvency measures that is used in state and local government research: cash solvency, budgetary solvency, service level solvency, and long-term solvency. I also looked at truth in accounting, which is has something called the taxpayer burden or surplus, which is actually kind of similar to Professor Inman's measure of fiscal stress that he was looking at. And I should say, and looking at these relationships, all of the measures, all of the fiscal solvency measures, with the exception of service level solvency, and I'm not going to go into that, but I think it's a fundamental problem with the validity of service level solvency. But the budget, in particular, the grades, the Volcker grades for budget maneuvers and legacy costs, were all associated with the other 3 solvency measures. In other words, as governments undergo more fiscal stress, as their solvency gets worse, they engage in more legacy practices that increase their legacy costs and budget maneuvers which are more risky. And so we've heard a lot of comments today about, our governments state governments actually doing better as a result, after the recession, and I think there's a debate over that. But to the extent that governments are doing worse or have not recovered from the Great Recession, this means that they're going to be implementing more budgetary maneuvers in the future and more risky kinds of budgeting practices. I don't think this is kind of a surprise to anybody, but what was interesting is there was no relationship between any of the fiscal solvency measures and the grades for the rainy day funds. So that sort of led me to think about that this lack of relationship suggests that maybe in Volcker, as well as in our research, in our academic research, and the research by the non-government research organizations represented here, maybe we should be looking at more things like, are the rainy day funds big enough? Do government's officials have adequate access to these funds? Do they have access to the funds when they are needed? Are there unnecessary limits on using and spending these funds? And are they replenished when these funds are appropriate? Now, I have a table in this research that looks at a lot of these kinds of conditions and categorizes or indicates how state governments what their rules are regarding things like caps, deposit rules. Do they require a deposit or some kind of balance, which can lead to not good circumstances if, for instance, state governments have to be depositing into their rainy day fund during a recession. I mean, that's not something that's desired. Withdrawal rules, some of these states have to, in order to use them, there has to be a majority, some kind of majority or a supermajority, or greater than a 50% majority to spend these funds, either all of the funds or spend them on particular things. And some of them have spending limits. And one of the other things I muse about that maybe we should be looking at is what kinds of strategies should be in these hierarchies. I mean, recognizing that governments, when they're faced with fiscal shocks and fiscal stress, they're going to they're going to do this hierarchical approach to managing the fiscal stress. So maybe we should be thinking about, are there some kinds of strategies, for instance, using rainy day funds, that's a good thing, but underfunding your capital spending, that's a bad thing. So is there a good hierarchy of strategies that governments should be using? So with that.
Well, thank you, Becca. And I think that refining the research on rainy day funds, as many of us are doing, would be a good practice in research because of the rules are so changeable. Why don't we go to Seth first to talk about, well, number one, you come from one of the more budget challenged states. Bob's paper certainly made that clear. What are you doing in the legislature to make sure that you're prepared? You had some difficulties in some years even getting a budget together.
Yeah. So we have two sayings in Pennsylvania: "Thank God for Illinois," and "Thank God for New Jersey." By the way, I've enjoyed my time here in Illinois. Chicago is a great city. I also appreciate the thought leaders from Pennsylvania presenting today. We have our challenges, like every other state. We were an old Rust Belt state, heavy manufacturing, going over to a new service industry. We had an easy time this year with our budget. It was weird, like being in the district over summer and not in Harrisburg on a prolonged budget battle. And I think it definitely has the point to Wayfair decision in tax cuts and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the federal level really brought some revenue into the state to help us balance our budget moving forward. But, our budget process has been in since 1978. I was born in 1979. The first Star Wars came out in 1978, and there have been many iterations of Star Wars since then. But our budget process has kind of been the stagnant process it has been. I was doing some research into kind of transparency websites, how to bring more transparency in finances to the state, to the Commonwealth, and kind of came across the Volcker Alliance report, and it kind of recognized the consensus revenue forecast. We got X's. Generally, actually, we didn't do too bad in the scoring, all in all. But it's something that piqued my interest because we've had some horrible practices in Pennsylvania of, the fake news. We have called fake revenue, of plugging in some revenue that really never will come to fruition, but we'll build it in there. And the problem is when you build, non-realistic revenue on ever-increasing demands of spending, you create automatic deficits within your budget. So we ended up trying to close previous year deficit as well as funding new spending for the next fiscal year, which creates a lot of obviously stress on your finances. And with a split Republican-controlled General Assembly, Democrat in the governor's office, it created battles on the forefront. We seem to have worked them out recently, but with consensus revenue forecasting, trying to remove the politics out of the political process. Very difficult, particularly when those in power get to control that narrative moving forward. In Pennsylvania, the governor's office does all the revenue estimates. They have to do the revenue certification prior to the governor signing the budget, and that's about it. Generally, our discussion in Pennsylvania is around how much we're going to spend, and then we figure out how to pay for it, sometimes months later, which is not good standard practice. But going through and starting kind of with the Volcker Alliance and looking at other research done in other states about consensus revenue forecasting, I authored House Bill 2013 to bring it to Pennsylvania. Basically, the budget appropriations chairman will be on the board, as well as some gubernatorial appointees, but 5 kind of individuals, public individuals who are geared towards finances. And I have a unique trigger in there that 2 people can say no and that revenue estimate is not done. A, it protects the minority, but more importantly, it gives the private sector, those public chairs, more of a say in case you have a runaway where Republicans and Democrats are decide to overestimate on fake revenues, or it's not a realistic revenue that they can pull back and hold it. And the worst trigger is completely removing the politics out of it, the elected officials. We have what's called the Independent Fiscal Office, kind of like a legislative CBO. They do revenue estimates, but it's non-binding, has a helpful guide. If they don't get it, an official revenue estimate by a certain point, it automatically triggers that we have to use their estimate, which means it removes everybody who normally wants to negotiate a budget, removes them out of the entire process. So it kind of forces that early discussion of how much we're going to spend, if that's the way Pennsylvania wants to do it. I think it's bad budgeting that way, but which we can fix in a later date, hopefully. But it allows, I think, a better way to get to that overall revenue number and make sure it's realistic so we don't have major deficits moving forward. And we can have a rational discussion of if we want to fund that amount of spending, go and fund it. Don't use the one-timers. Don't use the fund transfers. If you want higher spending, figure out a way to pay for it that's realistic moving forward in Pennsylvania. So hopefully we can get that moving. And again, the politics of it, if you're involved in the process and you hold all the cards, you never want to give up your cards. You never want to give up the power you have. So it takes a little while to get there. Luckily, we have great thought leaders in the General Assembly. So it's been more of a discussion internally to try to move towards more realistic revenues and try to show, nationally I'm very competitive by nature. So I like to be number one in the good parts, not in the bad parts of data. So we have a core group. We have some good caucuses around financial reforms created in the State House. So hopefully we can move forward with some of these reforms and turn Pennsylvania around.
Well, thanks. And I live in New Jersey, and we say thank God for Pennsylvania and Illinois.
Yeah.
And Connecticut.
Yeah.
So, Rich and Catherine, you've been watching best practices and worst practices for a long time. For us, for the Government Performance Project at Pew and elsewhere. So, tell us about your impressions right now.
One of the things that I worry about is that people will tend to think that how things are right now, right this year, are how they're going to continue to be, and sort of the optimism over revenue estimates coming in a better way than they did last year. That this reaction to tax changes doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that way next year. Over the 25 years we've been observing the whole thing, I think one of the big problems is that we're all talking to each other. We need to be communicating outside of this room. We were talking about this with Dick Ravitch, but it's not enough for us to say this to each other because people outside need to understand the quantity of the issues in terms of the pensions, and they need to be giving politicians credit for thinking ahead and for looking long-term instead of short-term. I think a lot of what we're doing with the Volcker Alliance is kind of pushing the idea that we need to be thinking long-term.
And one of the things that I'm very curious to see in the work of the Volcker Alliance, assuming that the work goes forward for a reasonable amount of time, is that what we're seeing coming through from the academics who are feeding us the information is that a lot of the budget gimmicks are less commonly found this year than they had been in prior years, because it's very easy if you're running a surplus not to have to borrow money for the next year. You've got all the money you need. But again, Catherine refers to 25, it's 28 or 29, but she's a woman and wants to be younger. What we've seen is cycle after cycle, our states saying when they've come into better times, we're never going to do those things again that kick the can forward. We learned our lesson. We saw how difficult it was to retrench the dollars we spent that we didn't have. And then come the next recession, they do it all over again. Now, maybe they won't this time because perhaps the Volcker work will educate people. That would be a dream and a fantasy and a nice thing if it happened, but I doubt it. I think that this is just a cyclical thing, and I'd be curious to know what Representative Grove has to say if he ever cares to comment on this. But it's just tough if you're a legislator to keep behaving well when it means that you're going to either have to raise taxes or cut services.
Well, before we get back to Seth, let me just ask John, who's got a page of scribbled notes here, and looking over his shoulder, the book on state budgeting and lessons learned from the economic downturn. Notice it's a very thin book. Which certainly lines up with what Rich and Catherine were saying. But I see you've got transparency and capital budgets and rainy day fund use highlighted here. So tell me what's on your mind right now.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
The biggest issue.
And happy to hear and happy to read a lot of the researchers and other folks' use of the data that we collect through our NASBO surveys with our 50 executive branch budget offices. And so that's heartening to see, because we're interested in seeing the filters that you all use and look at. And I love the hierarchy you just mentioned, Rebecca. That is, I've been in state government budgeting for almost 35 years. That is the behavior. When things turn bad, you know, what are the areas in which we do? I want to talk a little bit about rainy day funds. One of the things, we watch this very closely. A lot of good work is being done about that. One of the tensions about rainy day funds, and it's even in the scoring of the Volcker Alliance efforts, is the watch out for using one-time money to solve your problems, because it evokes a problem in the future. What is a sufficient rainy day fund? Well, those two things are somewhat in conflict. Rainy day funds are one-time money. And so this balance, and that's why the hierarchy is really interesting, this balance is what budget makers have to deal with as they walk into, first thing they see is a revenue shortfall. And John, we knew about it in the summer of '07 in Kentucky. What do you do first? How long is it going to last? And so when do you reserve your reserves? When do you apply those reserves? If you look at our data, you'll see different approaches that states have taken in the early 2000s and in the Great Recession as to how much of my reserves did I use when. Is just kind of an interesting illustration of the approaches that I think Rebecca has really talked about. What do you do first? Well, the first thing you do is you don't use your rainy day fund unless you're at the year end of a fiscal year and you can't cut because you're at the year end. And that happened in fiscal 17 when we had a couple of short years on revenue shortfalls. I think Kim was talking about half the states had revenue shortfalls in fiscal 16 and 17, right? And we're in the economic recovery. And so it was a trend because more than half of them did it. And so the issue of application of the use of however much you have in your rainy day fund there is no easy answer. Having worked for many governors and watched many legislatures, it's a hard question to answer. Balanced against spending cuts, you will cut spending. That is, as Dan White said, that is one of the first things you do. John made a really good comment. You will find budget officers and legislative budget officials. We know where every dollar is. You know, and we know we have the good list and we have the bad list. You know, and you want to go to the good list first, and then your governor will look at you and say, John, is that one of those NASBO things? You know, because maybe it wasn't the answer that governors wanted. So it's really interesting to look backwards. In the 02-03 period, about the same number of states used their rainy day funds as in the fiscal 9 to fiscal 2010 Great Recession. Almost the exact same dollar value when exclude California and Texas and Alaska, because they have really different situations. And so it's really interesting. We built it back up, as you've heard, to levels higher than they were before the Great Recession, but it took us longer because of the slow recovery in the economy. We built it back up after the 02 and 03 periods quickly because those years were pretty good years on the revenue side. And so it's been interesting. So even in the slow recovery times, states have built it back up, but there have been more headwinds in building it back up. But it's the lessons that we've learned from the Great Recession and before because now it's an expectation that you build up your rainy day funds. In the 80s and early 90s, and Arturo will know this, it wasn't always an expectation. That wasn't the tool that everybody had in their pocket. And so we have moved forward, you know, as a group of public financial managers and states in recognizing the value of that. And now with the Volcker Alliance and the work that Pew does, many other publicly facing information, there is now the decision makers, as Seth was talking about, it's now something they're expected to understand, know, and react to. And so that's been a positive action. The thing that happened in the last recession, the last two recessions, is we had federal funds bail us out. We spent less money in state general fund dollars in fiscal 12 on Medicaid than we did in fiscal 8. And it wasn't because we were spending less on Medicaid. It was because the feds came in during, doing the macroeconomic counter-cyclical thing that a national government should do. The same thing kind of happened back in 02 and 03, where we got funds. They called them state fiscal stabilization funds in the Great Recession. We used them for education and other general government services. We met the maintenance of effort process, but it was really an assistance to keep states from having to cut those areas more deeply than they would without the money. So that's something. Now you see others talking about the big, Kim talked about the big federal deficits. Bill talked about the Fed. What will be the headroom moving forward from national government to help us in the next one? Well, I'm not as bearish on the Congress side of things about that. I don't, just because there are big deficits doesn't mean they won't spend, right? I think we've got evidence to that. And so to forecast that it won't happen, I think is too negative. But states walking into 02 and 03 didn't expect federal help. When we came into the Great Recession, we were happy to have it, and it actually was operationalized in a fairly efficient way. So that's a couple things about that. I want to talk a little bit about transparency. Part of the Volcker Alliance, I think one of the better things about what that has done that other people hadn't done is how easy is it for you, for a taxpayer, for a state government decision maker to find information about your state finances and state budgets. And where do you find it? And is it comprehensive? And does it have the key things in there? I think that was an excellent addition to the work on looking at states. And so I have just a couple of comments about improvements to that. One, you're going to hear a session on infrastructure, capital budgeting, so I won't take any more of that. It's very difficult to go find states' capital budgets, and I'll let Jerry talk about that a little bit later. He did doing some great work there. The other is, and I want to point this out, is there's about 20 states don't publish a final enacted budget document, right? We know what governors do when they present their budgets. I mean, it's, I've written many of them. They're very detailed, and there's a lot of, transparent information there. As it works through the legislature, the transparency diminishes. Now, they're working, right? So some of that is you got to wait till they're done in order to publish what they've done. And so that's understandable. But at the very end, I will say there's 40% of us who quit. We don't produce documents that tells somebody, so what'd you do? And what did you do at a level, like, go look at the governor's budget. Can you find an equivalent of that after the enacted budget? You should. And so that's one thing I would add to that is we're kind of all worried about how the sauce is made rather than eating soup. And so I want more soup. I want to be able to look back and say, well, what were the decisions made? Because that helps you who help communicate to the rest of the public, inclusive of the media. In fact, the media is the only one that covers it through the legislative budget process. And so anyway, I point that out as an area of transparency that I think could be improved, and that a lot of us do it well, but not all of us do it well. And so that I would commend, to the idea of future cycles.
I'm going to take some questions now, but one question on or just to point out what John said. There's one state which I won't shame in this polite company, where the enacted budget is a marked up version of the proposed budget, but it's just like a big spreadsheet with lines through the original numbers. and it's incomprehensible because it's just pages and pages of numbers and lined out numbers with no explanation. And if you're not an extreme budget geek who knows what each line number means, you're out of luck. So it's very difficult, and the accounting and the reporting could be a lot better. Do we have any questions for people on the audience? Yes, right back there, and just tell us who you are.
I'm Lawrence Masala with the Civic Federation. Would love some examples of who does it well in terms of their enacted budget, who does it for those states. Is it the government?
I won't name names, but I will tell you afterwards. But half of the 30 states, the executive branch produces the document, roughly, and half the legislative branch. And in 2 states, both of them do. So it's a pretty even split between those who do it well, between who's responsible or who's chosen to publish that information.
We've got a question in the back.
Adam Schuster from the Illinois Policy Institute. I wanted to ask about the transparency score, and in particular, what goes into that, because it seems to me that there's 2 different types of transparency. One, sort of transparency in financial reporting, your ability to find information after the fact, and the other being transparency in the budget negotiation itself, and whether the public, interest groups, media broadly can sort of follow along and be part of the conversation as legislators are negotiating it, versus a budget being introduced, say, right before the vote, and whether that goes into the transparency score.
I can feel that, and maybe Baron Green want to comment on it, and Seth may have some opinions as well. It's a very simple score. I wish it could get into that deep into the weeds. The New York budget is a prime example. New York state budget is a prime example of something that's done late at night on the day before and ends up having non-budget legislation thrown into it to get it passed. So it can be quite difficult. So basically, we ask some simple questions. Does the state have a consolidated budget website where you can find out a fair amount about the budget and related information, while it's supplemental documents? The second question is, does the state have a tax expenditure disclosure report, either as part of the budget, or there's a couple states like Illinois where the controller does it. But is it regular? And that transcends what GASB requires for CAFRs. These get into the broad sales tax exemptions and tax code exemptions that mirror federal law. So there's about 10 odd states that don't do it at all. Utah, for all its great work, is very poor in that area. We ask about transparency in terms of infrastructure replacement cost disclosure, depreciated replacement cost. Initially, we found 2 states that do that, which is California and Alaska. The rest of it, it's piecemeal if it's there at all. We think it should be universal. We've since added Tennessee to the list because Tennessee does essentially what Illinois would do with the controller and tax expenditures. There's an independent body in Tennessee created by statute that does this on an annual basis. But it's still 3 out of 50 states. So you can find out the condition of roads maybe. You may be able to find some stuff out from the CAFRs. It's really, really, really difficult, as other people have pointed out today. That's pretty much the transparency basics. I think that's an area to be expanded, though. Most states, the cities, everybody has online checkbooks, but then what if you don't know the context? Is it how much value is that?
Bill, I'd like to add something, which is that in at least a couple of the areas, the tax expenditure reports section and the existence or not of a comprehensive budget, we give credit to a great range of skill, so that there's a certain amount of generosity here, that if states are trying to do things and are doing them up to a certain acceptable, reasonable, rational level, they'll get credit. But the range in there can be pretty broad. And actually, I did jot this down, anticipating the question, that Arizona's website was one of the best in the country. You could find last year's budgets. You could find all kinds of supplemental information. You could find budget briefs, which is great. You could find details about the agencies, and a lot more. California was another good one, has an interactive interface, which allows the public to find information about previous budget years. And at the other end of the spectrum, I could go on kind of indefinitely, having gone through all 50 states, but at the other end of the spectrum was a Western state that has a lot of gambling, which had a bare bones assemblage of information, including little more than a PDF of budget and agency budget requests biennium, which I'll just say one last thing and then see if Catherine wants to add, which is that one of the things that makes us personally craziest are things that only appear in PDF form, so that we can't manipulate. We have to do things on our computer that I never understand to convert it.
Yeah, some of the things that Rich and I have been doing in working with the Volcker Alliance is asking why things don't happen. And we come back to the universities and we say, well, okay, there isn't a tax expenditure report in Iowa, for example. Why is that? So one of the things that worries me is how this connects, the lack of doing the right thing connects with the decrease in state employees and the problems with, what you pay employees and being able to hire the people you want to hire. And very specifically, so Iowa does not have a tax expenditure report, even though it is, the one that is done consistently, and they want to, and the legislature said they should, and kind of dictated it, but they don't have the capacity to do it. And particularly with federal tax reform, that's what they're putting their time into. They don't have the time to do the thing that we would say is really necessary for transparency.
I would say quickly from a transparency form, if you have a lot of state laws that put all the financial data in the hands of a few, I would remove those laws and open it up for public notification at minimum, get it towards the General Assembly. I've moved a lot of amendments this past year on some budget reform bills to stop pointing everything at just the Appropriations Committee, because the staff will get it. They don't necessarily share it with the General Assembly. And not every member of the General Assembly will review financial data information, just to be honest. But those that do and want to have greater insight, it opens the door for not only them, but the public and academic research. I have a subcommittee of oversight on the appropriations. I actually did a hearing on the CAFR, talk about snooze fest, but it's important. It's important financial documentation that you should review, and it's kind of your end of the year, close the book look at where you're going. So it's important to do those kind of things. We have a bill moving in the General Assembly to require agencies, when they submit their budget documents in the budget process to the budget office, they have to post it online and send a notification to the General Assembly. That kickstarts your entire budget process up to the October, November timeframe, so you have a better understanding of where agencies are. And that's something the General Assembly, we really don't get. We don't see the recommendations of the agencies. We just see the executive branch, the governor's recommendation. So we don't necessarily get that data. So your Medicaid office says they need a 5% increase. Is it new programs, or is it actual demographic changes that require that increase? So the more information you have on your front end, the better your product will be at the back end. And with the General Assembly, you have to get that information. You have to force the time frame as early as possible to make sure you can get it done within the time limits of every fiscal year.
Okay, I think how are we doing on time? We got time for one more question.
Over there.
Yes.
Please use your microphone.
On, yes. Transparency there strikes me as three parts: produce good numbers, publicize them, And then saliency. How do you get people to pay attention? I asked that specifically of Seth and John, who I'm going to suggest are probably in the trenches more. How do you get it out there so people go, wow, that's good, that's bad, I ought to pay attention? How is that done?
Can I just add, I think that the decline in coverage, in news coverage, in state houses and city halls has had a big effect on that. California's tax expenditure budget, these are public resources that are provided to the populace. I'm not saying these are bad or these are good. It's $45 billion in the last budget. That's a fair chunk, that's equivalent to a fair chunk of the state's spending. Now, California does a pretty good job explaining what all those numbers are. New Jersey, believe it or not, does a fabulous job explaining what all those numbers are. How you get people to pay attention to that's really the job. It's partially the job of reporters digging this stuff out. We've got very good CAFR disclosure now of corporate and property development tax incentives. Nobody pays any attention to these damn numbers, and they're good numbers. So it's partially a challenge for the reporters in the back of the room, the reporters in the State House, and for policy organizations to really highlight this. And this goes for other transparency measures as well. Why isn't something being done?
There is a lot of research out there on transparency in government. It's primarily with other nations. And they find in general that transparency does improve financial management practices. But in many cases, it's only under other conditions. There's a lot of interactive relationships. So transparency doesn't matter, for instance, if the state doesn't have a tax and expenditure limitation. But if the state does have one, then transparency does matter. Those kinds of things.
Bill, can I just quickly add, mentioning getting it out there? There's this wonderful study of budgeting in Uganda in which they found out people were stealing the money like crazy, but then they began to publicize it to the mothers. And when the mothers found out that their kids were supposed to get $100 worth of school supplies and were not, things changed very quickly. So the question to me is, how, to you, Rebecca, how does that get down into the trenches in some ways?
This is my first, doing this paper is kind of my first look at this transparency research. So I haven't kind of sort of have it all in my mind as to what it means. But I was like I said, I was very much struck by, if you just do transparency for transparency's sake, if the tree falls in the woods and nobody sees it, did it really happen? So that was my sense in looking at it.
Our state treasurer created his own transparency website, and if you pull it up, the first graph you'll see is a regression line of the general fund, what the current general fund balance is, and he has red and he has green, and you can kind of see what $1 billion we're at, and then it's a regression line on debt. So the first, you see general fund, regression line down, you see regression line on debt on the increase side. So that'll capture your general public and your press. So those kind of cutesy charts and graphs, that's what the public and the press are looking for. So if you have a transparency site that has those things, you'll probably get more play. And if it's downloadable and you can start posting on Twitter and Facebook, use your social media, you'll draw attention. And then for probably the academic level, if you want greater detail, providing kind of the drill down, the background for that for more of the, I'll say the academic level of finances. So you got to have a combination of the two. You got to capture the general public. They're not going to drill down on the individual expenditure level unless they're really interested. So. Yes.
Your saliency question is a really good one. When I read a budget that comes out, there are certain questions I want answered. From the summary brief material, the governor's budget is a marketing document as well. And so in some of that marketing, you get some of the answers. What were the marginal changes? What were the decision points? What do you want highlighted? But also would like to see, they're also directed at the legislators because they've got the next step. And so in some cases, the information is also aimed at the next set of decision makers for whom the governor would like support of his decisions. And so the audience is kind of the rest of the world, legislators, and then geeks like us. who pay attention to the detail. But I think that's a really great question is, so what makes a good budget document from a transparency standpoint?
I would like to continue this discussion for quite a while, but we have another panel coming up on revenue volatility. I see Don Boyd smiling, waiting to jump into the pool here. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Jeff Holland from the Peterson Foundation, and panelists. We're expected to do a class picture out in the break room. Thanks very much.
Legacy policy.
But your fiscal solvency is